Hey, listen, look, in your honor, I've worn my BBC Micro t-shirt today. Where's your ZX Spectrum? Where's your ZX Spectrum t-shirt?
It's somewhere on a pile. I don't pick my
somewhere.
clothes. It's always from the top of the pile that comes from the washing machine.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist Shorts. I'm Richard Simon. This is the second in the series of shorts that we're going to be focusing on GitOps and Crossplane and related technologies. This episode will be really talking about the Crossplane project, and we'll be kind of looking at how you can build control planes without needing to write any code. Or at least that's what the project seems to claim. I'm pleased to welcome back Viktor Farcic. Viktor is from Upbound. Hello. And Viktor is, what is your title these days, Viktor?
I don't know. I think it's probably developer advocate.
Evangelist, advocate.
Maybe. I do random things, and then there is probably some title.
The random guy. Okay. So Viktor has his own YouTube channel as well called the DevOps Toolkit, I think. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more maybe about that, and certainly provide some links on that later on. So welcome back, Viktor. Good to see you. Let's dive straight into Crossplane, because that was kind of a segue from the first talk that we did last year. And yeah, so can you give us a quick sort of intro to Crossplane, please?
So I think that there are two key points with Crossplane. First would be to extend Kubernetes to manage everything, right? There is that wrong assumption that Kubernetes is only and exclusively something that runs your applications packaged as container images. What we are doing in many other projects, just to be clear, is going further than that, right? And with Crossplane, you can use Kubernetes with all the tools and all the processes and whatever you're doing today in Kubernetes, but to manage everything. And everything can be anything like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, on-prem, this or that, right? So it's continuing the evolution of Kubernetes. And the second part would be what we call compositions. That's to create the right level of abstractions for somebody to consume something. So let's say a database in AWS, that would be like 7, 8, 9, 10. Nobody knows how many resources, subnets, VPCs, this and that. And then you can wrap it all together and say, hey, you just need to create something in Kubernetes called MyDB, or whatever you want to call it. Those are the things that matter to you. And I'm going to give it to you as a service.
Right, cool. Okay, so it kind of works as a control plane, and it's sort of really designed to sort of address or kind of addressing control planes at that level. So why do we need crossplane? What's the idea behind that?
So we need it because it's awesome. That's the first argument.
Okay.
So we need it simply, if you look at evolution of Kubernetes, or even if you look at initial design of Kubernetes, it's first and foremost extensible API. Right, that's the main goal of Kubernetes itself. Containers are just the beachhead, the first thing that somebody implemented using those principles, right? And over time, you saw projects like KubeVirt, for example, that allows you to use Kubernetes to manage virtual machines, and many others. And Kubernetes is just following that trend, but with a much more aggressive scope, right? So we're not focused on, hey, how can we extend Kubernetes to do one more thing? But how can we extend Kubernetes to do everything? And the reason why we need it is because there are quite a few things that we might be missing from the previous generations of tools, right?
Yeah.
We need an API, we need drift detection, reconciliation, and so on and so forth. Right.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, it's an open source project. It's administered by the CNCF. Upbound, the company that you work for, is actually donated the project. So in terms of the business benefits, just briefly kind of give me like a 30-second for the business. What is it doing from that sort of enterprise side?
Typically, there are two personas from the business perspective. There are, let's call them builders, right? The experts, experts who know something like, hey, previously I mentioned database, right? I know how to manage databases. I know how to manage Kubernetes clusters. I know how to manage this or that, right?
Yeah.
And those would be the first wave of beneficiaries that can use Kubernetes with all the ecosystem tooling like GitOps or logging or monitoring and so on and so forth to provide that something. And then the second layer would be the end users of that something, right? The idea is to create what I mentioned before, those compositions, and stop being reactive, right? So instead of you saying, hey, open a Jira ticket and I will give this to you, whatever that something is.
Yeah.
How about I provide it to you as a service, meaning I'm going to define a new interface, something that does not come out of the box from anywhere, right? This is specific to you, to your organization, to whatever we're doing. So it's essentially enabling some number of people in a company to provide services to others, what we typically today call platform engineering, right?
Right.
And use all that expertise from different personas, different groups of people, and churn it, put it all into a platform, right? Internal developer platform. And then from there on, let's say developers, testers, so whatever somebody is can just say, hey, I want a database. How about I do kubectl this or that, or I send it to Git and then let Argo CD or Flux synchronize it, and off I go.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of simplifying some of those things that we've kind of maybe enjoyed a little bit too much on the technical side with Kubernetes and GitOps and, you know, all these platforms. But this is kind of helping to.
Simplification is the important part.
Yeah.
And, you know, typically you have two types how you can simplify things.
Yeah.
You can be vendor opinionated, meaning Heroku, for example, where you say, hey, me as a vendor, I will design this service to be easy for you to consume. And you will have to comply with the goals and the requirements of that service. And that works great, but mostly when you're starting from scratch, right?
Right.
Now, in case of Crossplane and other tools, to be fair, it's slightly different. Instead of providing you with a service like Heroku-like service, we're providing tools so that you can define what that service is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So let's move on to the kind of cross-plane architecture a little bit. So it's kind of touted as a quote unquote extensible backend that enables you to orchestrate applications and infrastructure no matter where they run. So that's certainly very attractive because it's allowing you to address multiple, you know, sort of, you know, targets sort of environments, so whether they're clouds or whatever. So if I'm kind of in a multi-cloud environment, can I use it to deploy to the AWS and say maybe Azure?
Yeah, so to begin with, there are different layers there, right? First, you have Crossplane itself. Think of it as an engine that doesn't do almost anything by itself.
Yeah.
And then you have providers. Let's say Azure provider, which gives you, I don't know, 400, 500 more or less services on Azure side. And as a result of installing that provider, you have the same number of custom resource definitions and controllers in Kubernetes. Or same thing for AWS, like there is EC2, right? RDS, what's not. And so we are not trying to unify that in any form of way, because those attempts fail always, right? Because Azure is always sufficiently different than AWS and so on and so forth. You get one-to-one mapping. Everything that exists in one will exist in your Kubernetes cluster, and all you have to do is create this resource that is equivalent to something on the other end.
Right.
What makes it interesting is those compositions I mentioned before that allows you to say, okay, so when we create a Kubernetes cluster in cloud, this is how it looks like. And behind the scenes, I'm going to do different implementations and say, if you have a label called Azure in that definition and everything else exactly the same, this is how it's going to work in Azure. This is how it's going to work in AWS. From the end user perspective, it's all the same. You're creating something called my Kubernetes cluster, right?
Right.
But behind the scenes, you're leveraging all the pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages of each of those providers.
Right. Okay. So, so kind of just looking at what it's helping me with a little bit more. It's kind of, it said it's allowing you to create those sort of Kubernetes environments. Certainly, that's kind of the main thing that it does. But it's also sort of policies, permissions. It's an extensible environment. You mentioned the providers, which are kind of the plugins or sort of extended sort of connectivity into these clouds as well. So let's talk a little bit about the sort of the policies, permissions, and that kind of extensibility.
The beauty of Crossplane and any other, I'm going to call it Kubernetes native tool or project, right?
Yeah.
Is that it does not need to do any of those things that you just mentioned.
Oh, okay, right.
And the reason why it doesn't is because all tools today that are designed in certain way to be Kubernetes native interoperate with any other, right?
Ah, oh, yes, yes.
So we don't need to figure out and reinvent the wheel like it was happening a lot in the past, and say, oh, okay, so now we're going to dedicate a year to figure out how we can provide as a Crossplane community policies for Crossplane. No.
Yeah.
It works in Kubernetes, and then what you choose your favorite tool, right, to manage policies. And I'm using them as example. Kyverno, OPA Gatekeeper, Cloud Custodian, doesn't matter, right?
Right.
And the same thing goes for logging, observability, or anything else. That's the real power, I would say, and I'm not really now even talking about Crossplane, but of the whole CNCF for Kubernetes ecosystem. Everything plugs to each other, and you can combine tools in any way you like.
Right. And so, so you kind of mentioned a few of those. So maybe kind of Styra as well with OPA, the Open Policy Agent.
Yes, OPA like would be definitely one of those.
Cool.
You get simply, you're managing something, whatever that something is, as Kubernetes resources. And then just as the same policies you would use to manage your applications running in that same Kubernetes cluster can be used to manage resources that end up creating something in AWS.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So the architecture for Crossplane, I think as I said, it's kind of shares that sort of Kubernetes sort of structure, and presumably it kind of works well with the sort of the likes of Terraform and Ansible and so on. And it kind of gives you that ability to address the public cloud. Now, the area I wanted to kind of really focus on a little bit was on the sort of the low code or no code sort of claims that are made around Crossplane. So we mentioned sort of composition, but what is that sort of low code, no code kind of giving to to enterprises? What's the advantage of that?
So the advantage is, I'm not specifically happy about low code, no code as a term. What I like to say better, I feel, is that it allows you to create the right level of abstraction, right?
Right.
And that right level of abstraction fields that you need to fill in to do something. Or maybe the right level of abstraction is, I want a database and I'm going to give you only the name. Everything else is I don't care about, right?
Right.
So the key, I think, in companies and enabling people to do something is to figure out what is that right level, right? It can be anything from as simple as a button or as complicated as 1,000 lines of YAML.
Sure.
And once you figure out what that right level of abstraction, then you create a custom resource definition that has one field or 1,000 fields. It's up to you. And then you need to figure out how you want people to interact with it, right? And this is the key part. Do you want people, do people want to write YAML? Do they want to write JSON? Do they want to have a web UI?
Right.
And here's where Kubernetes comes as extremely helpful, right? Because it has an API that is, meaning that you do not need to create anything special. All you have to do in that hypothetical web UI to say, okay, go to Kubernetes API, get the schema, paint it on the screen, and off you go. I do not need to know what that something is. I just need to know whom to ask. What is it? And that's Kubernetes API.
Cool. Okay. So Yeah, then I think that definitely makes sense, and I definitely kind of see it. So one last question on this, and very briefly, on the idea of kind of the likes of these tools, like like Crossplane. We've seen some others kind of um, more commercial ones like Stack Guardian and so on. They're all kind of around that sort of cloud orchestration. What's your take, very briefly, on these kind of creating a so-called sort of super cloud layer?
That's coming. I'm still having internal debate with myself how that will look like.
How's it going to work? Yeah.
Exactly. So, and the major use case I see today is not necessarily I can run X anywhere, because that's very costly. But what we're definitely 100% seeing today is, yes, I'm going to do machine learning in Google. I'm going to run my clusters in AWS, and I'm going to use Azure for this or that, and Cloudflare for something else.
Yeah.
So multi-cloud, multi-hyperscaler, all those things are here right now. The only question is, what do you do where? Whether you use all of them for the same thing, which I'm not sure, or leverage the pros and cons of each of them.
Right. Excellent. Well, Viktor, thank you very much for your time. I've got a ton of other questions. Maybe you should do like a separate session
So
on
the third one.
Yeah, we'll do a third one, carry on the conversation. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to kind of dive into it a little bit more. But we are due maybe to do a demo on the third talk that we've got listed. Cool. So we'll definitely aim for that. All the links to Crossplane, Upbound, and Viktor's channel will be in the description of the video. So please do check those out. Yeah, thank you again, Viktor, and thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching this talk. If you enjoyed the content, please comment, share, like, and subscribe to support the channel. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. See you next time.